so that, great.
Got it.
Well, thank you for making time this Sunday morning to hear about what turned out to be an amazing trip to Israel and the Palestinian Territories in July and August. I've got some slides to share, and I'll stop at a few different points to take questions. And if there's something urgent as we go through it, don't hesitate to interrupt me. So let me share my screen. Okay, can you guys see that?
Yes, we can.
Well, it's
Yes.
loading anyway.
Well, not at the moment, but
There we go.
we-
There we
There
go.
we go.
Take a second to load. Great. So just to level set, I've shared this presentation with a number of people, and sometimes it's helpful just to level set on the history and geography of the region at 100 miles an hour. So, and I know many of you are quite knowledgeable about the region and have visited as well.
But we
The
forget.
Ottoman Empire was controlling the area through basically the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And the British came in after World War I, and as they did in lots of different parts of the world, they kind of messed things up. And then there was a partition plan following World War II that allocated the land to ideally 2 states. And as we know, that didn't quite happen the way that might have been intended. The armistice lines following the War of Independence become a really important terminology I wanted to share with you. When they were divvying up control, they took a green marker, and I've heard it legendary, like it's on with a map on someone's knee, squatting in the streets, and they drew lines that are now called the green lines. And what's interesting is that they were not drawn precisely on some drafting table. They were drawn with a marker that had some thickness to it, which actually has led to some interesting disputes just because of the thickness of the marker, like what exactly is the green line. But in any case, at that moment, the green line defined Israel, and I'll show you a map in a second, in a certain way. The West Bank was under Jordanian control, Gaza was under Egyptian control. And what's really interesting, I want you to remember this next piece. The land allocation was 78% to a Jewish state and 22% in the territories. We'll come back to that 22% in a bit, because that was actually the same number, not by coincidence, that was discussed in Oslo some decades later. As you know, there was a 6-day war where Israel's borders were expanded quite substantially, and then a peace treaty the following decade where the Sinai was returned to Egypt. As an aside, the Israelis kind of encouraged Egypt to also take Gaza, but apparently Egypt said, no, thank you. Be very interesting to see what might have occurred if that had happened, because one of Gaza's borders is with Egypt today, the smaller border. I'm going to let someone else in. And then in 1993, one of the most potentially powerful agreements was reached. It's called Oslo. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And they defined the space in 3 areas, A, B, and C. And we spent a lot of time on this trip talking about A's, B's, and C's location-wise. Area A, or Palestinian Administrative and Security Control, Palestine, or Palestinian Authority controlled. Certainly Ramallah and Gaza fall into that area A, completely Palestinian. Area B is kind of this hybrid with a plan to move to all Palestinian control, but Israel still has an important control over the security. And then Area C, which is by far the most controversial and the most interesting, and I'll be talking about, is 60% of the land of the West Bank, and it is under Israeli control. In Oslo, they basically said East Jerusalem and the holy sites are really hard. We'll figure that out later, which of course continues to be a challenge to figure out. And at that same moment, Israel did recognize the PLO as representatives of the Palestinians. So there was recognition that there could be negotiation. Here's the map. There you can see the green line in green around Gaza and the West Bank. When a lot of people do talk about security and of Israel, which of course is super important to us as Zionists, it's important to know that the borders with Egypt on the south and Jordan on the east are quite peaceful. We actually visited the Jordanian border, and I'll show you in a moment, a few minutes, what that looks like. There were like two soldiers with their feet up on, on a bench, like, monitoring the border. It was hardly a fortified border, as there is clearly in Lebanon and to Syria, as you might imagine. So some people also called the area within the Green Line, the full area that you see on the map, from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Some people will call it Judea and Samaria, which has political connotations as well. So that's just a quick map. I think you're all pretty familiar with that. So just briefly, I went on this trip with J Street. J Street, for those of you who are not familiar, has a mission to educate and advocate within the US political system for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and also raise the visibility of pro-Israel, pro-peace initiatives within the American community. A big piece of their work is to take these periodic trips to Israel and the territories with members of Congress. This trip included 12 people like me who are volunteers and passionate about J Street's mission, and 4 members of Congress, and I'll introduce them in a moment. So here's our itinerary at 100 miles an hour. The first day we were in Tel Aviv, and we spent some time at the Peres Center. If you haven't been to the Peres Center, it is absolutely worth several hours. It is beautifully situated right on the sea, and it helped me understand just what an amazing man Shimon Peres was. We also took a lovely walking tour of Old Tel Aviv, which is something I had never seen before, and Old Jaffa. And you'll see sprinkled through the itinerary was opportunities to meet with all sorts of activists and people who are politically oriented and people who are doing community organizing. So SEDEC, for example, is an organization. I know many of you are familiar with JCUA in Chicago. SEDEC is like JCUA. They like work in urban centers, and they help people advocate for just improving the quality of daily life. It may just be like getting the trash picked up, but it's helping people really learn how to advocate for themselves, especially in cities that are shared, meaning Palestinian and Israeli, or Palestinian and Jewish residents. We got briefings pretty much every night at dinner and every lunch. It was like my head was exploding by the end of this trip. And they were all very interesting and very chock full of information. Day 3 was—
Karen, before you move on, you skipped over the last bullet.
On security policy with Nimrod. I'm going to be coming back to that, actually.
Okay.
I'm not trying to cover every single word on the slide, Mark, but Nimrod Novak provided, I think this was intentionally at the beginning of the trip, because of course security is the beginning, middle, and end of most conversations about peace in the Middle East. So this was really level setting on that piece. The more detailed update on security I'll share with you, Mark, was provided by the IDF. I'll share that in a minute. The third day was an overview and a pretty deep briefing on the Israeli-Palestine conflict with some academic leaders. The IDF strategic briefing, which I'll share the key points by Brigadier General Setter, was really insightful to me. We visited David Ben-Gurion's house in Tel Aviv. We had a lunch update on politics and public opinion, which was incredibly insightful. If you're like me, it gets a little bit confusing, all the different political parties in Israel, and Dr. Scheinlin did a lot to at least try and organize it a bit. It helped me understand sort of what the big pieces are. We met with several members of Knesset, including Gabi Lasky from the Meretz Party, and Ayman Oda, who is an Arab, and he's in the party that I think has been called the Joint List. What this picture is, there were 3 different dinners that we had over the course of the trip. And this was in someone's beautiful backyard in Herzliya. And it could have been in the backyard in Wilmette, with, lovely tables and music and a lovely buffet. And they invited Israeli political, business, and civic leaders there. So the very cool organizing concept here was that there would be tables of like 8 people, 1 or 2 people like me, a member of Congress, and then local activists or business leaders. So you really had a chance, just like you would if you were having dinner with 6 or 7 people, to have really in-depth conversations. You can see I'm actually studiously taking notes there. Next to me is G.K. Butterfield, who's a congressman from North Carolina. Next to him is a woman named Galia Golan, who founded Americans for Peace Now and Combatants for Peace. This guy over here is a significant journalist. This is Jim Clyburn speaking. He is the House Majority Whip from South Carolina, very, very powerful and influential member of Congress, and he was just greeting us. But the folks that were there were really quite impressive, and it was inspiring to me to see what they were all sharing and talking about, and how passionate they are about making a difference. These are the priorities that the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, shared. One of the things I thought was kind of fun, I'd never heard before, was they called it the reverse Vegas rule. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. I think we all know that the Middle East is certainly central to so many world politics. So this guy is in charge of strategy and developing strategy for the IDF. So he's looking beyond the next year or two and looking out, he said, I think 10 to 15 years. And these were the 6 things he said were the most important things from a strategic security perspective. One is that the global order is being challenged by Russia and China. We know that. And their goal is to keep the Middle East unstable, perhaps other parts of the world as well. That's a different conversation for a different day. They view the main threat as from Iran and their proxy and Iran's proxies. And they're seeing a lot of, obviously, nuclear progress and increased cyber capabilities. And it obviously indicates a crucial need to continue to support the Iron Dome and other offensive measures. As a quick aside, and I'll come back to this as well, at the end of my trip, the second to last day was when the Gaza hostilities began. And I experienced pretty much firsthand how effective the Iron Dome is. I was never personally at any risk, but there were sirens going off, and the Iron Dome deflects like 97, 98% of the rockets. It's kind of magic, and it's pretty amazing what it does, especially for those who are closer to the Gaza border or the West Bank, because it's so incredibly effective and in reducing what could be bad. What was interesting that the Brigadier General shared was, it's not, when they count how many people are saved because of the Iron Dome, it's not just, oh, that rocket might have killed 10 people or injured 5 people or whatever, but also when you then say, if that had killed, God forbid, 10 people, then there would have been retaliation, which would have killed 20 people, which would have caused escalation. So there's really a way of, it just keeps the temperature down, which is really quite important. The third piece he shared was that there's an improved collaboration, atmosphere for collaboration, especially with the Abraham Accords. And while I'm never going to be one who is going to sing the praises of the immediate past president of the United States, the Abraham Accords have certainly created some decent relationships to add to the peaceful relationships of Egypt and Jordan. So that's great. They talk about Bahrain and UAE for sure. As there's daily flights now between Tel Aviv and either Abu Dhabi or Dubai. It's important to maintain stability for Israelis and Palestinians, civilians, to have routine lives. There's obviously a lot of concern about support to build tunnels, especially from Gaza, to reduce smuggling. There are very strict restrictions on what can go into Gaza on trucks. Anything that could be construed to be either building tunnels or building weapons of any kind are not allowed. So cement, for example, isn't even allowed to go into Gaza. The fifth priority he shared was increasing or supporting Israel's qualitative military edge. We know that Israel's military is incredibly accomplished and has an edge, I think, by any measure. And they are increasing their ability to have precise strikes to prevent terrorism, which is important for them to maintain. And again, this is as shared by the IDF. And then the sixth thing was really interesting. This was not one that if we were brainstorming strategic priorities of the IDF that I think we would have come up with, which is climate change. And they're thinking about how the military needs to change as it gets hotter, as there are more intense storms, which we of course are all witnessing, around the world. So I thought that was pretty interesting how they're thinking about combat actually changing. Someone in the group asked, well, why isn't the occupation on this list? And this guy, who's a very senior, accomplished guy, said that's above my pay grade. So he wasn't interested in engaging on a discussion about the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. The trip continued to Gaza and East Jerusalem. We, of course, did not go into Gaza. Gaza is Area A. I don't think I'd even be allowed to for any number of reasons, the primary being being Jewish and being an American citizen. But we did go to the border. And this picture of this woman is holding a piece of a rocket. She lives in a kibbutz that is about a mile, maybe even a kilometer away from the Gaza border, Kfar Azaz. And their life, of course, being on the Gaza border is very much central to thinking about security. There are shelters on every corner in every building. And when there were the Gaza hostilities, just 2 days after we visited, I was thinking about, the kids we saw running around and the people we saw. And of course she opened up her cabinet and there were like all sorts of remnants of pieces of missiles and rockets, pieces of the Iron Dome, because actually when the Iron Dome is used, it actually rains down pieces of metal that were used to deflect the missiles. She told some pretty scary stories that Gazans are sending balloons and toys and kites over the border, hoping attached to explosive devices, hoping children will find them. So they spend a lot of time looking for that kind of thing and educating kids not to pick up, what might look like a toy or kite. Really, really scary stuff. We then went from there to East Jerusalem, which is, of course, just a stone's throw from the holy sites, and got an amazing tour from this guy, Danny Seidman. For those of you who are on Twitter, he's well worth following, is Daniel Seidman. He is considered one of the foremost authorities. He's the one who gives tours to presidents and, very, very important folks because he's so knowledgeable about what's going on there. We stood in Sheikh Jarrah, which is, again, really just moments from the Israeli part of Jerusalem. And we saw dressed up Orthodox Jewish people hanging out, in my opinion, like gangsters. They were sitting on the hoods of cars. They were sitting there very intimidating to the people who are residents who are trying to drive in. There's a lot of violence that goes on between the Palestinians and the Orthodox folks who are living there. And it's really, really complicated and really scary. We had dinner that night with East Jerusalem leaders, which was really interesting because those are folks who firsthand are experiencing the inability. If they wanted to go to a restaurant in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, they would probably be stopped. They might be harassed. One of the guys was very late because he was stopped at another checkpoint. We met some really amazing people who are at that moment were especially interested in understanding the murder of the Palestinian American journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh. And because there were 4 Congress people on our trip, they certainly were very interested in getting their attention to make sure that that was getting the right kind of visibility to understand what actually happened. We then really started getting, every day got a little bit more intense and a little deeper. And we had an amazing lecture on Palestinian nationalism. We met with Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammad Shtaya. We toured a settlement, we actually saw one settlement that was part of a collection. Mate Benjamin is a collection of, I think, 30 or 40 different small settlements. And we met with the governor of that settlement. The biggest aha to me at that moment, and I'll spend some more time talking about the settlements versus other parts of the West Bank, is one of the congressmen asked the wife of the settlement governor, like, do your children play with Palestinian children who live just over there in the Palestinian village? and she was like, oh no, they're all terrorists. They're dangerous. We never let our children near them. And that's a follow-up question, which was like, so do you have any relationship with anyone who's Palestinian? Oh no, they're dangerous. So there's a lot of, and I know that it goes both ways. I think some of that happens on the Palestinian side as well, that there's this sort of indoctrination of folks on both sides of the conflict, thinking that everyone is dangerous, everyone is a terrorist, and it's obviously gets quite insidious. We met with the president of Israel after that, and then that night we had dinner with many more human rights and civic leaders. So we really had the opportunity to meet with many folks. As an aside, Mark, that was the night I had dinner and sat next to Tarek, who is the head of the Arava Institute in Israel. And that morning I had gotten an email from Mark and Zach saying, wanted to just let you guys know all the Beth Emet Israel committee events coming up this fall. And I looked at it quickly and sort of put it away in my email, figuring when I got back home, I'd put it on my calendar. Well, Tarek, who is coming to Beth Emet in October, as an aside, was literally sitting next to me. I could not have been planned. He was sitting next to me. He's like, "You're from Chicago?" And he's opening up his email. He's like, "I'm coming to your synagogue in October." I'm like, wow, well, this is a small world. So watch Emmett Mail for the details on that event. He is an amazing guy. He was the most senior Palestinian ever to be in the Israeli government. He was like the chief scientist of Israel for some period of time. And he now runs the Arava Institute, which is focused on climate change. So terrific guy. We'll be seeing next month or this month. The next day we went and spent most of the time on the West Bank, and we understood in more depth the landscape of the settlements. We spent a lot of time with maps to understand what's going on, and what is an intentional effort on the part of the settlement movement to surround Palestinian villages, to limit the number of Palestinian villages that could have be contiguous with others. We saw Hebron, which was among the most sobering moments ever. I remember being in Hebron on prior trips to Israel, and it was this vibrant marketplace and some really interesting historical sites. And it's like literally a ghost town now. The Israeli army is completely in charge of the space. There is a very large settlement just on the hill. And the marketplace, which was owned and run by Palestinians, the doors have been welded shut. The main marketplace bazaar is literally closed, and Palestinians, residents of Hebron, Arab residents of Hebron, are not allowed to walk on the streets. They cannot open their businesses. They cannot even literally walk down the main street safely or legally. So Hebron, parts of Hebron are Area C, which means under Israeli control, and a piece of it is Area A, which is where there's a big refugee camp. Now you hear the term refugee camp, and I don't know, for me, I always thought like tents and something very temporary. This has been in place for decades. And so they're buildings and really, really poor. It's very, very poor, sort of dusty streets, and it's fortified. And you have to go through a checkpoint to go in either direction. And we visited UNRWA, which is the UN Relief and Works Agency refugee school. As an interesting fact, President Trump stopped funding these refugee works, the several billions of dollars that went to support refugees, healthcare, housing, food, schooling. And as soon as Biden came in, he reinstated that funding. Obviously, letting people be hungry and extra poor is not a solution to security issues. We then spent some time going to South Hebron Hills, and I know many of you have probably heard of these, and if you watch the sort of Israeli news at all, you're familiar with Susia and the South Hebron Hills. I'm going to come back to this in some detail. We met in Susia at Nasser Nawaja's house. I use the term house quite liberally. It's kind of a shanty. And I'll come back to Nasser in a few minutes. And then we had dinner with the U.S. Ambassador, Tom Nides. And then the final day, we went to Yad Vashem, which is a very intentional way to close the trip, especially for the members of Congress, to sort of punctuate how important the Holocaust Memorial is to the Jewish people and the Israeli people. And then we went to the Jordan Valley, to the edge of the Dead Sea, to really understand even more the effects of climate change. I was shocked by that, and I'll show you some more pictures of that in a few minutes, but I was genuinely shocked by how much the Dead Sea had receded. I was there just 4 years ago, and it was noticeably smaller. As I mentioned, there were these great group dinners, and you can I'm not going to read every word on these pages, but you can see the kinds of representatives we met with. These are people who their entire existence is focused on finding ways to have a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict across every possible dimension. It's education, it's political, it's sort of ACLU kinds of activities, film, education, et cetera. So it was really quite amazing, and we really were able to make some very intimate contacts. Before I move on, I want to take a breath and see if there's questions that have come up. I see there's something in chat. Let me see if I have addressed that. Oh, yeah, I know that when on the trip that Rabbi London took to Israel, you met with Danny Seidman. He is really quite something. Are there any other questions from anyone? I'll keep going then.
Well, Karen,
Yep.
I'm trying to remember, when did you go on this trip?
The last week of July and the first week of August.
Okay, so it was before what amounts to, it appears, a third intifada, although it was in the works. So I just found it interesting the way the IDF presented its strategic plan, because it emphasized normal lives without really talking about what that
Yep.
means in terms of what they consider now to be normal.
Exactly.
Given what they consider to be the security concerns. And obviously, I'm very concerned about the security issues, but at the same time, it didn't seem to me that they were giving the Congress people a true picture of what goes on and why.
Right, which is why J Street orchestrates this agenda in a very intentional way. So you don't hear the full story from the folks in the settlements. You don't hear the full story from the IDF. They have their own agendas, as everyone does, right? But as over the course of the week, the Congress people were presented with a full story. It's a great segue, Mark, to an important point. I'll actually show the four members of Congress who are on this trip are shown here. Jim Clyburn is the most senior person to ever come on a J Street mission, and probably the highest level that could ever come, because Nancy Pelosi is not going to go on a group trip, and Steny Hoyer is pretty conservative in this space. So that he had never been to Israel before, nor had what turns out to be his best buddy, G.K. Butterfield. They're close friends, and they've been in Congress together for decades. They had never been to Israel before, so they were sponges, big time. What was interesting about GK and Jim is they're both part of the Black Caucus, as you'd imagine. And as what I've come to learn is that most Black people who go to Israel on these kinds of trips see things through the lens of the American Civil Rights Movement. Not surprisingly, Jim Clyburn quoted Martin Luther King and John Lewis for some reason or another, like multiple times a day. But what's important is it's not the same. There are aspects of it that are the same, but you could see that they view things through that lens. Mary Gay Scanlon is a very new congresswoman from Philly. She was terrific. But Salud Carbajal is the one I want to address, and Mark, your question made me think of. Salud Carbajal is in this picture on the far right. He was born in Mexico. He represents a piece of Southern California, and this is his third trip to Israel. And his first was with like the local federation, and the second was with AIPAC. And he, about 3 days into this, was like, they never showed me this before. Why isn't anyone talking about this? And by the last day, he's like, I can't wait to get back to Washington to talk to my colleagues about this, because no one's talking about it. So the IDF isn't going to say what's going on. The settlement folks clearly aren't saying what's going on, depending on the local members of Congress, or members of Knesset. You may not hear it. So that was really insightful to me to hear his perspective of like, they never showed me this. They only talk about security from sort of a very clinical perspective, not the implications of tamping down on a group of people to the point where they have potentially, serious retaliation.
Yeah. Karen, can I just mention, when I was on the board of the American Jewish Committee, the trips that we sponsored always had meetings with key Palestinian leaders that
Mhm.
were totally free and totally full of criticism of Israeli policy.
That's
For this
great.
reason, it also reminds me how many of the younger Jewish generation talk about being alienated from organized Judaism because when they went on birthright trips or other things, it was totally so one-sided that they
Yes.
felt they had been misled. So I think it's, his reaction, I think is unfortunate, but I'm glad that he has seen a balanced picture through this trip.
Exactly. And what's good is Jim Clyburn, who is broadly viewed to be the kingmaker behind Biden's presidency. He has a weekly meeting with Biden, and he's now obviously much more literate in the issue. It was a little horrifying to me, to be honest, to see someone who's been in Congress for decades, had never been to Israel, and clearly hadn't understood the issue with any depth. But better late than never. He now we went back with some very specific things to consider. I'll actually end this presentation with some of the short-term things that we asked Clyburn to go back to Biden with and to go back to his colleagues with. So I wanted to sort of not wrap up, but share sort of an overarching view of the things that I took away from the trip. And it took me a few weeks after I came back to really be able to process it. And I put it into two categories: things that made me feel really discouraged, but things that gave me great hope. And I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit of depth so that you understand where I'm coming from. On the hopeless side, I saw egregious human rights violations that are continuing. And the occupation is increasing and methodical, and there's a lot of political inertia. On the hopeful side, Israel is an amazing place. We all know that. J Street and other organizations are making a difference. There will be real change at some point, I'd like to believe, and I think it will be the next generation of leaders. And it's really important to remember that this is not a zero-sum game. There's ways to find win-win. So I'm going to go through each of these with some words and some pictures for you. What I saw, I've attended countless webinars and speakers through J Street and other organizations for many years, and I was shocked at how bad it is for the Palestinians in the Area C of the West Bank. They have little access to water, electricity, infrastructure. They're not allowed to vote in national elections. So you could have a settlement right next to a Palestinian village in the same exact geography. The folks in the settlement are able to vote in national elections, and the Palestinians do not have Israeli passports, are not allowed to vote. There are rigorous checkpoints that limit the freedom of movement, the freedom of employment, increasingly the freedom of who you can fall in love with even. There's intimidation, harassment, and violence by the Israeli military and settlers. I think you see that in the news. Human rights activists are viewed as terrorists. I mentioned this guy, Nasser Nawaja, whose home we visited. Right after the Gaza hostilities at the very end of my trip, he was arrested. He's nowhere near Gaza. He lives in the South Hebron Hills, which is on the other side of the country, and he was arrested and detained for a day, just because, to intimidate him. He had nothing, there's no reason to believe he had anything to do with anything. He's been a peace-oriented activist for his whole life. And what you do see a lot in the news is the constant threat of demolition in the South Hebron Hills and in Masafer Yatta, which is a region. And we came to understand that in a lot more detail, why that is. Nasser's home has been demolished 5 times while they're building the settlements across the valley. And they don't give permits to travel. They don't give permits, they being the Israeli government, don't give permits to build or move. So it is really really, really difficult to be a Palestinian living in this part of the world. Here,
Karen, before you jump off
mhm,
the
yeah,
first bullet,
yeah,
you know, in when Israel started, so a big part of how things were to be built was through the Jewish National Fund, which only built for Jews.
mhm,
And so you know, your first bullet also reflects the fact that this has never changed. And still a lot of the funding comes through the
yeah,
Jewish National Fund and government funding with it, which excludes Palestinians
yeah,
who
yeah.
live within the Green Line.
Yes, that is true, definitely true. And by the way, and funds grow building outside the Green Line, as far as I
Yes,
know.
as
But
well.
what's
Yes.
but what's really interesting, Mark, is um, on Nasser's land. This is a shanty of a dusty, dusty little village with under a dozen families. On his land are water pipes taking water to the settlements and electrical wires taking electricity to settlements. And they have asked to have a meter put on to take water and electricity and pay for it, and they've been denied. So can you imagine on your land having water pipes, electrical poles, and you have to rent a truck, go miles and miles away, get a permit to get trucks of water for your village. So it's not even, it is in addition to what you're saying, there's actually real policy that is discriminatory, that keeps folks from having the most basic, in my opinion, human needs. So this also involves East Jerusalem, and the South Hebron Hills and the West Bank. I'm trying to think. Gaza is completely shut off. Gaza is completely closed. But there are 26 communities that are under constant threat of demolition. You've seen this in the news. They basically say, well, you don't have a building permit. Nasser, when you rebuilt your house for the 5th time after we demolished it last time, you didn't get a permit to rebuild. Well, they wouldn't have given, he applied and they don't give permits because that's just part of the discrimination. So we're going to demolish your house, which is literally, it's certainly nothing that you would say, I need that land. There's no reason. It's literally intimidation. And the police and military are quite nearby. We actually went to this overlook, looking over Masafer Yatta, and there were police cars and army trucks there, just to kind of add an element, I think, of like, just so you know who's in charge, we're in charge. There is a lot of settler violence. They vandalize almond and olive trees that are centuries old and harass people, and they are not subject to the same punishment as the reverse would be true. I mentioned they're not eligible to vote. And one additional sort of piece of information I learned, I'd never heard of the term Area E1. Have any of you heard of E1?
Mhm.
I see Mark sort of nodding and no one else. Okay. E1, and I'm not going to get too wonky with maps, but there's this one area of the West Bank. If you're standing in Jerusalem on like Mount Scopus, looking out over the valley of the West Bank, there's this one particular area that hasn't been built, and if settlements there, it's occupied by small Palestinian villages. The settlement movement wants to put settlements in Area E1. If they do that, based on the archipelago that's been created of settlements surrounding different Palestinian villages, it's like the last puzzle piece. If there's ever to be a long-term view towards peace or a peaceful solution and a Palestinian state, if someday, that puzzle piece makes it extra hard, because it makes it so that there isn't an opportunity for contiguous connection between Palestinian villages. So that's one of the takeaways that the Congress people were asked to go back to DC with, was just don't build a settlement there. We're not saying you have to agree to a 2-state solution or do anything, but just don't build something that's going to make a future peaceful solution impossible or much more difficult.
Karen,
Mhm.
on your second bullet there, you know,
Mhm.
while I agree with what you've said, I think we should also note that part of that security presence is to protect Jews living in various parts of Israel, not just the settlers. And so there is a legitimate reason for some, but not necessarily all of that security presence.
No disagreement there, but to go in and sort of rough up people who are living peacefully in a Palestinian
Absolutely.
village, is definitely, they've started like when, I know that when we were there, some peace activists had parked their car to go walk and try and protect some olive trees that were being threatened. And the Israeli army towed the car away. Like there's just stuff that it's like, that
Well,
wasn't hurting anyone. There's just like a lot of intimidation going on.
there's plenty of times when there is violence between Palestinian farmers and settlers, and the IDF only arrest the Palestinians because they have no jurisdiction to arrest settlers, and the police are in a no-go position for the most part over that. So yes, all that adds to what
It's
you're
awful.
saying.
Right.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, as I'll talk about in a minute, the Palestinian Authority is ineffective is probably the kindest word I can come up with. So, you know, they're not able to make some of these things happen. So just some quick pictures. This on the left is Nasser's family, his wife and his 3 kids. That's Nasser to the right. He works for an organization called B'Tselem, which is a nonviolent way to document what's going on in the occupation. You can see that they're very, very poor, and you know these are not desirable places. And you can see just over the ridge in the bottom picture is a settlement. One of the things I learned, and on the right, in the top right, is a picture of a Palestinian village. One of the ways to really quickly know whether you're looking at a Palestinian village or an Israeli settlement is it green, meaning there's irrigation and water? Are there water tanks, which means there isn't running water, which means it's Palestinian. So there's these very quick ways of saying if there's not a water tower on top of the building, it's probably Israeli. If it's green, it's definitely Israeli, and it's a Jewish settlement as well. This is just a picture of like when we were just pulling over, there's police and military there. There's a lot of barbed wire and checkpoints, and there are 2 sets of roads, some that go to settlements, which are beautifully new paved, and those that go to Palestinian villages that are really, really rough. Some of this is because of funding and the Palestinian Authority, as Mark was pointing out, there's different jurisdictions, but it is increasingly a tale of 2 cities. It is increasingly, you know, nicer, irrigated, secured places, and places that are really quite destitute. I talked a bit about Hebron a few minutes ago. It is the largest Palestinian city by far. There was real tension there. You know, Jim Clyburn, because he's so high ranking, came with his own security detail in addition to what a normal J Street trip would have, which is certainly secure. He had his own posse of people, 2 Chevy Suburbans from the embassy, a couple Israeli military folks, a bunch of Capitol Police folks as well. And they were surrounding him at what I viewed like a presidential level of security. They were on every shoulder. They were looking, they had snipers. It was really kind of really, really palpable because there's so much, it's like a tinderbox. There's so much, you get the sense you're on the verge of violence between this, again, this Palestinian village where these folks have had their shops welded shut, aren't allowed to walk down the street, and this lovely green irrigated, you know, settlement just right next door. And you know, you've got generations of folks now who were raised under this, and it's a very scary place. It is very, very intense. And you know, when there's when there's anything going on, like Hebron is often a place that gets even locked down even more. So when there was the hostilities in Gaza in mid-August, you know, the IDF doubles down on making sure Hebron is secure, which just actually adds to the tension. Here's some pictures of Hebron. You can see these were once vibrant little marketplaces, and now it's literally with Israeli flags going over it, and it's just a dusty street, and the IDF is quite present. Let me spend a moment on Gaza. It was regularly called the world's largest open air prison, and the more I learned about it, the more I think that's a very apt description. There are 2 million people. About half are unemployed, more than half depend on some sort of assistance. They're young, the 3rd generation living under occupation, and it's closed. You can't get in and you can't get out. And 96% don't have access to clean water or more than 3 or 4 hours of electricity a day. if you were lucky enough to have skills to go want a job outside of Gaza, you need a permit to travel. And guess what? The Israeli government gives very, very, very few permits. You'd need to have some sort of very special skill. It's a couple, I think the number is like 5,000 permits are given. So nothing. And people, if you needed some sort of really special healthcare or any healthcare, the chance that you're going to get it promptly is really quite low. And then when there's any hostilities, they just lock down Gaza. What was interesting to me was how restricted the economy is. So for example, they only have 2G instead of like the 5G we have. And if you're trying to run a business or any kind of communication, I think we can all remember how painful 2G would be. Israel controls access to the sea. They've closed the airport. There are very strict export restrictions. So if you had like a garden, I mean, it's pretty densely populated. It's not a lot of farmland. If you did have a garden and wanted to export it, they're very specific about what you can export. So one example I heard, which was very real to me, was if you grew tomatoes and you wanted to export the tomatoes, you're not allowed to export tomatoes that have any stem or any leaves still on it, which means they're going to rot right away. So you might be able to grow tomatoes, but when we buy them in the grocery store, they have the stems on them, which keeps them a little fresher, or they're refrigerated, etc. You can't even, it's a very specific list of what you can export. There's one crossing for people in the north, another crossing for goods in the south. And Gaza is simply considered a hostile entity. So it's really not surprising that there are, generations of people growing up there, hating the Israeli government, hating Jewish people, being completely ripe for acting out. When the day after our Congress people left, and I don't think this was coincidence, the Israeli government assassinated some terrorists living in Gaza. No question about that, or no dispute. The Gazans then, in the only way they can, start sending bombs and rockets and try and retaliate in some way, which the Iron Dome happily deflected almost completely. But it's this hostility back and forth because the Gazans have no other way of responding to that.
Actually, Karen, they do. But as long as they say from the river to the sea, kill the Jews, this is what happens. So that's one place where I think, you and I are not in total agreement as to how we look at it.
Right. Well, I don't disagree with what you say, Mark, but what I think is important is, from my perspective, I don't agree with what the Gazans are doing or saying, but I can understand that they feel completely constrained in everything they do. They don't have access to anything and they're kept down. So I understand, again, I'm not apologizing for it or agreeing with it. I can understand that you get generations of people growing up without access to the most basic human needs, and without the freedom to say, I'd really like to go do this thing. I'd like to go visit a relative in the West Bank. I'd like to go travel. I'd like to go get an education. By being held down in that regard, I understand how that causes people to be like, why would we expect them to be like, take the high ground in terms of, oh yes, we're not going to retaliate, we're going to stop. So I'm not looking to get into a debate here, but I can understand how living in an open air prison without anything can cause generations to say, well, screw them, I'm going to do whatever I can to undermine the Israelis.
I can agree with that in part, but the screw them came first.
When Israel
left Gaza, the Hamas and other terrorist forces were the ones who created this, not the Israelis. But I do agree with you that Israel's response at times has been, I'll just use the phrase, over the top. And so it does worsen those attitudes. And politically is not helpful.
Yeah, I'm with you. What was interesting to me was, this is obviously always in the news, and these are just some headlines I grabbed like the week after I came back. Israel demolished a Palestinian's home in violation of court orders. He lives in a tent now. They raided, you may have seen this, 6 Palestinian human rights organizations in Ramallah, which is, by the way, Area A, which is under the control of the Palestinians. Israel Israeli army went into Area A, which is they're not supposed to do, and welded shut the door to 6 human rights organizations that are broadly viewed to be peaceful, not to be like shadow terrorist organizations. Obviously, the Gazan hostilities provoked all sorts of things. And then this bottom right is Nasser Nawaja, who I mentioned. He was, raided and detained. He was taken away in handcuffs and blindfolded to be interrogated. It's like he said, like, if you just asked me to come in and talk to you, I would have. So it's this intimidation that is really constantly reinforcing the tensions that are already there. I want to say a little bit more about the settlements. As I mentioned, they're really easy to identify because they're green and they have electricity and water. It is viewed as Area C, which just to remind you is an area that's Israeli controlled, Israeli security. But the folks in the settlements are like, we live in Israel, even though it's beyond the green line. Unequivocally, we live in Israel. They have the right to vote. They have all this incredible infrastructure that's been provided to them. Conversely, and they feel the Palestinians are dangerous. Conversely, the Palestinians who live in the same geography are not viewed as being Israeli, do not have those infrastructure investments as well. And as you probably can imagine, the settlement population is growing very quickly. A, because more settlements are being built, and B, because Orthodox families tend to have a lot of children. So that's just a continuing trend that is making a long-term peaceful solution more difficult. You can see how green it is. It's like there's vineyards being grown there. This on the right, the far right guy is the governor and his lovely wife. And then that guy sitting down is the husband of Mary Gay Scanlon, the representative from Pennsylvania. And standing there is Jeremy Benamy, who's the president of J Street. So we had this lovely visit in their air-conditioned living room, where they served us lovely food, knowing that just across the way, they don't have the same things. And, and I will use the word racist. These folks just assume every Palestinian is a terrorist and is bad. And it was really kind of hard to spend time with them.
Karen, did they talk about the fact that for them, this is a religious cause? This is God's cause.
Interesting. What I learned, not at all. What I learned was so you could make that argument if you're in Sheikh Jarrah, which is there's a tomb of some patriarchs in Hebron, or a tomb of an important person in Sheikh Jarrah. You could argue they're closer to a religious site. Turns out the most radical, I use the word radical, the most intense settlements are furthest from the religious sites, almost all the way to the Jordan River. So that didn't even come up, not even coming up.
Well, for them though, God gave them the land. And my friends at Chabad here talk about it the same way, which is it's all a religious site because God gave us the land.
Yeah.
And that's pretty scary.
I'm sure there are people who believe that's no question. I didn't hear anything religious from them. That was part of the frustration, was like, you can almost believe if you want to believe on the religious side, or I want to be really close to Rachel's tomb, or like in that case, you could almost say, okay, there's like a deeper affiliation to the land. There's nothing in this land, believe me. Michael, did you have a question?
Well, I guess my question was, given all the polarization, why the settlement folks would even talk to J Street folks? Let them have them over for dinner.
Right. Great question. They don't usually, but they're happy to have us visit. And I remember sort of in the bus on the way to the settlement, it's like, Jeremy was like, don't try and argue with them. They believe what they believe. Just let them, describe their situation. And they certainly are very righteous. They believe that they're right. So they're happy to talk to anyone about it. We didn't try and debate it with them. That would be, futile. So, I'm sure there are some who wouldn't meet with us. There's no question, but these folks are so certain they're right that they want to talk to anyone they can about it. The next piece that sort of made me feel like the glass is half empty was this overwhelming sense of political inertia. The Palestinian Authority is not considered legitimate. The Palestinians I met are full of disdain for it. Their elections have been canceled. Mahmoud Abbas, the 80-something-year-old Head is, I think, viewed as corrupt and not respected. They still have a pay to slay policy, which is a really big deal, meaning they send money to the mother of the kid who is a suicide bomber or suicide, activist. The majority of Israeli voters identify as right wing, more than half vote right wing. So even the folks who are on the more liberal side of things don't have the representation in Knesset. I think one of the most frustrating things for me was when we had these lovely, polite conversations with the president of Israel, as well as the US ambassador. You want to say, so what are you doing? And we want to have a conversation. This is patronizing. It's very complicated, just be patient kind of attitude, which, makes me made us all very frustrated, because you can't just be patient. There are things that can be done. And, I think for those of us who are Zionists, it's like, we want Israel to be secure. We want Israel to be there. But there are scenarios that if you extrapolate from the current state are not good for that. So it does all require and benefit from US pressure and facilitation. We know that when J Street and other like-minded organizations advocate for not demolishing villages, for example, that the villages aren't demolished, which keep the pressure on, and it's necessary. These are just some pictures of us with some important people, whatever. This is member of Knesset Gabi Lasky, who's quite impressive. This is President Herzog, and then this is Clyburn talking to a Palestinian leader. So let's end on a more positive note. Israel is an amazing place. I've been, I think, 8 or 9 times, and it doesn't ever get old, no pun intended, because it's a very old place. It's a special, special place. And whether it's the holy sites, or the beautiful beaches, or the great markets, and just being in a place where Jews are, in many of the parts of Israel, or the majority, is really quite something. J Street and others are making a difference, being able to ensure funding for Israel's security. I mean, the US government currently funds Israel at $3.8 billion a year. That's a lot of money. And that is certainly important for funding the Iron Dome and many of the other security measures. And it also is helpful that organizations like J Street are keeping attention and pressure on the Israeli government to act perhaps with some more ethical behavior. And we know that informed members of the US Congress are making a difference. But, there is quiet behind the scenes influence. I don't think we're, like with Oslo, you didn't know Oslo was happening until it had happened. I'd like to believe that in some other, city somewhere, there are like-minded, open-minded, future-oriented folks who are meeting without any fanfare and without any drama, looking for solutions. So I'm very hopeful that that's actually happening. These are just some folks that I met with. This is Bashir, who's this amazing professor on Palestinian nationalism. This is Yehud Shaul, who is just incredibly knowledgeable about the West Bank. This is Galia Golan, who I mentioned. It's one of the founders of Americans for Peace Now and Combatants for Peace. This is Yossi Beilin, who I didn't know by name, but once I heard his background, I was duly impressed. He actually was at Oslo. He was the guy who was meeting quietly, and he's been a minister of justice and a minister of all sorts of other things. And at these dinners and this is at this lovely backyard in Herzliya. He was talking about his vision. He still has hope, and there's still he still has very specific ideas of what that might look like. And then at the top right is in Shimon Peres's office. This is Jeremy from J Street, as well as Nadav Tamir, who is a terrific guy. He is the Israel director for J Street. He was consul general from Israel to New England, and he was sort of the protege of Shimon Peres. So very interesting perspective from Nadav. Another thing that gives me hope is this next generation. Throughout this trip, I met many younger folks who are courageous and really making a difference. And you can see some of the examples here in the work they're doing to protect freedom and document violations and organize communities. And one of the things that occurred to me, as you know, we heard from the Brigadier General that climate change is something they're thinking about. We visited the Jordan Valley and saw the huge amount of shrinkage of the Dead Sea and the Jordan River. There are organizations like the Arava Institute and EcoPeace, which are really focused on climate change. And what's cool is obviously climate change doesn't know borders, disputed or otherwise. And so that these are organizations where you have Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians meeting every morning on Zoom to talk about and figure out how to address the climate stuff, whether it's desalinization, irrigation, obviously some of the magic stuff that Israel's developed over the last several decades on how to grow things in really difficult climates. So that gave me a lot of hope. And another plug for hearing Tariq from the Arava Institute speaking at Beth Emet in person in October, later this month. I have the date on the last slide for you. That's Tariq on the far left. That's Avner, who is one of the folks from Breaking the Silence, which is an amazing organization, which is former IDF soldiers who talk about what they had to do as soldiers, in some cases quite difficult. This guy on the bottom from EcoPeace shows the shrinkage of the Dead Sea. And then on the right side, this was a dinner table I was at with Jim Clyburn and this guy, Ahmad Mano, who runs a bookstore in East Jerusalem that sells a lot of literature and academic stuff about the region. And so it was amazing to see them connect. And Jim Clyburn was kind of mentoring him during dinner about like how he could be a leader and stuff. It was really kind of powerful. And then finally, it's not a zero-sum game. I'd like to imagine scenarios where Palestinians can lead dignified lives without impinging on Israel's security. These both have to be true. Perhaps as two separate nations, perhaps as there's some scenarios with one nation, there's some scenarios with three. The majority of Jewish Americans support a two-state solution by Pew and other studies. And they also, in large amount, as American Jews, believe construction of settlements is an impediment to that. And then we learned a lot about Shimon Peres's vision for peace, and you can read the words here. He's just really a really powerful thinker. I liked the last part, which is look to the future, not the past. As Jews, especially older Jews who were part of the founding of Israel out of the ashes of the Holocaust, it's very easy to look back and say this is a reaction to that, but it's really about remembering less, dreaming more, move forward. I thought that was really kind of powerful. So there are paths forward. I think many of us on the trip were, our heads were kind of exploding with information, and we wanted to find paths forward. These are some of the short-term things. When I talked about a few minutes ago that we asked the Congress people to come back with some specific things. These are some of the very specific things that can be done today. The US can reopen the diplomatic mission to East Jerusalem from the US. We could reaffirm that this is an occupation under international law. It fits all the qualifications of that. We can reestablish the difference between Israel and territories, meaning in Area C, stop calling it Israel, it's Area C, and there's implications to a lot of things, including imports and exports and labeling, for example. Israel could ease Palestinian life with permits and development and water and electricity. They can stop the harassment and demolitions and evictions that serve no purpose. And they can stop expanding settlements and commit to freezing that area at V1, that puzzle piece that is potentially a strategic location. They can commit to freezing it. These are all things that can be done today. And the Palestinians have a piece of this puzzle. They can reform that pay-to-slay policy, of course, which we discussed with the Prime Minister of Palestinian Authority. They can reduce the incitement. They can lower the temperature in the West Bank and potentially Gaza. And they can also recognize that Jews have a connection to this land. So if all these things happen, perhaps the temperature gets lowered, perhaps there's a path forward, even if some of them happen. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but there are clearly middle-term and longer-term pieces that can happen. And J Street focuses a lot on balancing short-term, middle-term, and long-term. We obviously, in both the United States and Israel, have really significant concerns about democracy being at stake, and that feels like a higher priority in the immediate term. But longer term, focusing on regional peace, recognition, people-to-people connections. I mean, there's no substitute for actually meeting someone who has different views or a different perspective and seeing how that might help our thinking evolve, looking for environmental cooperation, and then ultimately some sort of a negotiated agreement. Again, I sort of imagine in some embassy somewhere where no one's even paying attention, between maybe some of the people we met who are young, talented, courageous folks who have a new view. We did meet with one young Palestinian leader who we're not even allowed to use his name because he's would probably be in big trouble for even meeting with J Street, who is the kind of guy that could make something happen. So it gave us hope that there were people who have a lot of influence, who are living in the influential in the Palestinian community, but are willing to reach across and see a different way forward. So final slide here, and then I'll certainly open it up to additional conversation. What can you do if something I've said here has sparked your interest or your curiosity? I know many of you are super involved already, but there are many organizations that are doing really important work. You can read them here. You can talk to your friends and your clergy. No problem with Beth Emet. Our clergy is quite supportive of J Street's mission. But for other folks, you know, the more questions you ask, the more you probe. This is not an easy topic, and there's always 2 sides or 3 sides to every one of these topics I'm raising. Contact your representative. We are also fortunate that our representative, Jan Schakowsky, if you all live in Jan's district, is incredibly supportive and is kind of the poster child for J Street. She's been on 3 different missions with J Street like I have been. If you're looking to get more news, if you go to jstreet.org/learn, there's a daily news roundtable that gets dropped in your box every morning. I find that to be really good to scan. And then there's 2 J Street events coming up. One is the annual Chicago lunch on October 27th. I know that you've received several communications through Beth Emet for it. If you're interested and haven't signed up, let me know. I can help you navigate that. And then there's a national conference in DC that several thousand people will be at from December 3rd through 6th. I'll be there. It's going to be amazing. And then Mark, the event where Tarek is coming to Beth Emet, is that October 19th?
I believe so. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe so. And we should also note that the Israel Committee is sponsoring a presentation on the midterms here and the Israeli election in November, not because everybody will necessarily agree with the entire perspective, but as a catalyst for discussion among Beth Emet congregants of what is the meaning of those elections. And the J Street person coming is really quite knowledgeable and should give us all a lot to think about.
Right. I mean, the reality is, you've heard Mark and me exchange here. There's no right answer. There's no shortage of opinions. It is incredibly complicated. The best thing we can all do is just be knowledgeable about it, talk about it civilly as we are. Because if someone had the right answer, I'm pretty sure we would have figured it out by now. It's really complicated. Michael, Susan, Greta, what questions do you have? Hi.
Joel, I've got 2 comments, Karen. The one word that overwhelmingly kept returning as you were describing the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians and everything involved with that was counterproductive. I have to agree with you. I understand why they are getting violent, why they have been violent. Yeah. I'm not excusing it. I'm not accepting of it, but I certainly understand it. And unless the Israelis change their behavior, I don't see what's going to change. The other comment I want to make, Israel has been an amazing place forever. But I'm afraid that slogan becomes an excuse for not doing anything. Right. It's an amazing place. Yeah, it is I agree. It's an amazing place in lots of different ways, culturally, scientifically, technologically, all kinds of things. But that doesn't seem to make any difference.
Amen.
I may be saying similar things in a different way. You talked about the Black congresspeople or representatives who came with you, and how they likened it to the civil rights movement. I'm thinking, and you're correct, it's not identical. There are some commonalities. And I think of things in this country, white privilege, the poor, underserved, to use catchphrases, in our own, city community alone in the Chicago area, and the violence and the whys and wherefores have some commonalities. I'm thinking about the woman you talked to in the settlements. Do your children play together? Oh no. And that percolates down. I remember seeing something about one of the problems in some countries is the unemployment. The young people can't get jobs. They get frustrated. There's a relationship there to some of that. And I think back to Vim in the north, and there was one, it may have been Judy Rhodes' son who lived there, and they had a very nice relationship with their Arab neighbors.
Sure.
So those were the better things, the more optimistic things. What you showed about Hebron, it is appalling, upsetting, distressing. I'm hoping that more Beth Emet congregants will watch this. We did see the former soldier at Beth Emet several years ago, and that was an eye opener as well. And the destroying your friend there, whose house was destroyed multiple times. How do you do this to people? And I remember the book that we read,
Yeah.
we discussed,
Yep.
and the discussions and the losses on both sides there, and how they came together to discuss what they could do. So it's a balancing act, but there isn't much balance at this point. So that was sort of venting and observing and thinking, and lots of bits and pieces that went through my head, obviously.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I mean, the only, do you mind, Mark? I mean, the only thought I had to say is I was thinking back to when we were there in 2019 with Rabbi London and Danny Simon talked, and one thing we talked about was, this is a piece of, this is a lot of this is very specific to Israel, but a lot of this is also a piece of, more worldwide trends. It's not that different from, the Donald Trump phenomenon. It's not that different from what's going on in India, Brazil, the Philippines, all over the place. And I'm not sure if that's
Hungary,
good or bad or what you
Italy.
do with that, but I think that's important to think about.
Yeah, it is. It is. And as Jewish people, I mean, I'm still thinking about what Greta said as well. I mean, as Jewish people, we believe in social justice. We believe in doing what's right, especially this time of year. We're even more focused on feeling like we should make the world a better place. It's hard to see Jewish people behaving in a way, that doesn't, I'm not proud of. I'm not proud to call I'm not saying the governor of the settlement and his wife are bad people. They believe they're right. They haven't personally done anything wrong, but there's so much infrastructure and lowercase I infrastructure behind that movement and behind people thinking, righteously about it's our land, to hell with anyone else, not our problem. That's the really hard part is being able to sort of swallow that.
And as you say, you have on the other side the science, the good, the amazing part of Israel. So I guess anything that is some part amazing has its opposite side as well.
That's right.
The other thing that struck me, you were talking about the Iron Dome and about the fact that the US government, in effect, finances a large part of that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay, so having said that,
Yeah.
what kind of influence does the government, the US government, actually have on the Israeli government that you would find acceptable?
Yeah,
They could say,
right.
well, we won't send you the missile to the Iron Dome. You wouldn't like that any more than I would like that.
Yeah.
So what kind of influence can we have on a government that seems quite intransigent? It
Yeah.
really
No,
doesn't want
there's no question. I mean, you're stating a true state, of course, a true statement about, follow the money, as it were. I don't think any of us on this call believe that that the United States shouldn't support Israel and shouldn't ensure Israel's security. That's for sure. But should those same dollars be used to demolish a village in Area C? That's where, I draw the line at that, and there are not currently restrictions. We just write them a check for $3.8 billion. I'm oversimplifying it. There's no question that the United States is critical. We heard again and again, as I talk about, there's peace talks and maybe some creative solution. The US is going to have a voice in that. There's just no question about it. And the part of the reason the Egyptian border with Israel is peaceful is money, maybe even the whole reason. We know that that's motivating to people. So the US does have influence to be able to say, we'll give you the 3.8 billion, but don't use it to build settlements. Don't use it to demolish Palestinian villages. There's ways to have accountability without taking the teeth out of, Israel's security. There absolutely are ways. So it's.
Can I mention 3 quick comments here? One, when I did the presentation from the Center for New American Security about 2-3 years ago on ways that Israel could adjust its security without jeopardizing Jewish citizens to make lives more palatable for Palestinians and to see if it would help. Everything Karen has said is perfectly consistent with those recommendations as to how to try to lower tensions without jeopardizing Israel's security. And I wanted to say that not only for those on this, but in case people are watching who may wonder about things like that.
Yeah.
Secondly, we should remember that the original vision of Israel, at least on paper by Golda Meir and Ben Gurion, was equal rights for Palestinian citizens and Jewish citizens, and a 2-state solution.
Yeah.
So if we're for those things, it's consistent with the original vision. And lastly, although Karen, you found it hopeful, and I do in a sense, the thought, when I look at the peace organization's 5, 10, and 20-year plans, is really discouraging in terms of the number of lives that are going to be lost during those 5, 10, and 20 years, if that's what it takes to really improve things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess one of the catalysts, I think, of course you're right, Mark, but I also think with Mahmoud Abbas being as old as he is, I think that we're less than 5 years away from something changing. Don't know what that is, and I can only be hopeful that it's positive. It might not be, but I like to be an optimist about these things. Well, thank you for your great comments and participation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very
I
enlightening.
really appreciated the
Thank you.
opportunity to share this with you.
Very well, very interesting. Very well done.
Susan.
Thanks, Karen.